Welcome to our unflinching examination of how perfectly respectable imperial citizens trade their souls for sensations beyond imagining, told with the detached cynicism of someone who's witnessed one too many pleasure cults flourish under the Imperium's nose. In this documentary, we'll dissect the methods and spread of Slaanesh worship with academic precision and a healthy dose of dark humor, because frankly, if you can't laugh at humanity's spectacular capacity for self-destruction through hedonism, you'll go mad from the horror of it all. From the gilded spires of noble estates to the narcotic-hazed underhive vice dens, no corner of imperial society is immune to the whispers of the Prince of Excess. We'll examine infamous case studies, worlds like Laodomia, where an entire aristocracy fell to pleasure, cults within a generation, and hive cities where simple drug trades became gateways to damnation. Through these examples, we explore the psychological, social, and utterly predictable pathways that lead ordinary people, yes, even that prim administratum clerk or devoted shrine keeper, into the clutches of the Dark Prince. Prepare for vivid accounts of cult development that would make a sober man reach for the nearest bottle. Tales of sensory amplification, ceremonies in noble ballrooms, narcotic sacraments in factory basements, artistic obsession twisted into demon worship, and excess cultivated so carefully that victims don't realize they're damned until pleasure and pain become indistinguishable. We'll see how these cults remain hidden behind facades of culture and refinement, how they expand through networks of desire, and what kinds of souls find themselves drawn to the Prince of Pleasure's eternal performance. So pour yourself a drink, preferably something strong but not too enjoyable. We don't want to start down that particular path, and join me as we investigate the most insidious corruption in the Imperium. The cults that promise paradise and deliver damnation, all while their victims smile and beg for more. The psychology of excess operates on a simple principle: humans are never satisfied. The Imperium, in its infinite wisdom, provides the perfect breeding ground for Slaaneshi corruption by creating populations starved for sensation, beauty, and meaning. Consider the average hive worker, toiling in monotonous 16-hour shifts, breathing recycled air that tastes of rust and despair, eating corpse starch that has the texture and flavor of industrial paste. Their existence is deliberately dulled, pleasures rationed or forbidden entirely, hope, beauty, joy. These are luxuries the Imperium cannot afford to distribute to the masses. Now imagine if someone offers that worker a single moment of genuine pleasure. Not much, perhaps just a stimulant that makes colors brighter, food taste real, or dulls the constant ache in their joints. That first taste is always small, calculated, safe, but it opens a door in their mind that can never quite be closed again. They remember what it felt like to feel good, and suddenly the gray routine becomes intolerable. They want more. They need more. And Slaanesh, ever patient, is happy to provide, one escalating step at a time. The genius of Slaaneshi corruption lies in its gradualism. Unlike Khorne's obvious bloodlust or Nurgle's visible decay, the path to the Dark Prince is paved with what seems like harmless indulgence. A worker accepts a recreational chem to ease the day's pain. Feels wonderful. Next week, a slightly stronger dose. Then perhaps an invitation to a private gathering, where the chems are better quality and the company more interesting. Before they realize what's happening, they're attending midnight ceremonies where pleasure has become a sacrament and excess a form of worship. This pattern repeats across all social strata. For the impoverished, Slaanesh offers escape from suffering through sensation. For the wealthy, the Dark Prince offers new experiences when they've exhausted all sanctioned pleasures. For the artist, promises of perfection beyond human achievement. For the ambitious, paths to success through charisma and manipulation that border on supernatural. Each person's weakness is different, but Slaanesh has infinite variations of the same seduction. The Imperium's own authoritarian prudishness inadvertently feeds this corruption. By forbidding so many simple pleasures, by making even minor indulgences seem transgressive, they create populations primed for rebellion through hedonism. When everything enjoyable is already somewhat forbidden, the line between recreational excess and heretical worship becomes blurred. A noble who's already breaking minor sumptuary laws by importing off-world wines might find it's not such a large step to attending a salon where even more exotic, warp-tainted delicacies are served. Moreover, the Imperium's crushing conformity makes anything different seem appealing. In a society where individuality is suppressed and everyone must worship the same way, dress the same way, think the same way, the promise of unique experiences becomes intoxicating. Slaanesh doesn't demand conformity. The Dark Prince celebrates uniqueness, at least initially. Your particular perversions, your specific obsessions, your individual desires, all are welcomed and encouraged. It's only later, when you're thoroughly ensnared, that you discover you've simply traded one form of slavery for another far worse. Slaaneshi cults don't recruit through violence or overt coercion. They seduce. Their networks spread like a particularly pleasant poison, moving through social connections, shared interests, and the all too human desire to belong to something exclusive and special. Understanding how these networks operate requires examining the various entry points the Dark Prince's followers exploit. The pleasure house and salon circuit provides one of the most effective recruiting grounds. In any major city, there exist establishments that cater to desires just barely within imperial law. High-end brothels, narcotic lounges, private clubs where the wealthy gather to indulge in sanctioned vices. These places walk a careful line, providing enough pleasure to attract clientele while maintaining a veneer of respectability. They're also perfect fronts for Slaaneshi operations. A cult will often establish or infiltrate such a business, using it as a sorting mechanism. Most customers come, enjoy their purchased pleasures, and leave none the wiser. But the staff watches carefully for certain tells. Customers who seem dissatisfied with standard offerings, who ask for something stronger, stranger, more intense. These individuals are marked as potential recruits. Perhaps the proprietor offers them an invitation to a private room where special services are available. Perhaps a fellow patron strikes up a conversation and mentions an exclusive gathering that might interest them. The key is making the target feel chosen, special, privy to secrets others aren't worthy to know. You seem like someone who appreciates the finer things, the recruiter might say with a knowing smile. I host a small salon where we explore pleasures beyond the mundane. Very select company. I think you'd fit in perfectly. The invitation is both flattering and intriguing. Who could resist? These salons start innocently enough. Good food, better wine, interesting conversation, perhaps some artistic performances. The company is sophisticated, the atmosphere refined. Maybe there's some recreational chem use, but nothing that seems dangerous, just enough to enhance the experience. Attendees leave, feeling they've discovered something rare, a pocket of civilization in the Imperium's brutal universe. They eagerly return for the next gathering, but with each meeting, the intensity gradually increases. The food becomes more exotic, rumored to contain mild psychoactive ingredients. The performances grow more provocative. The chem use becomes more open and experimental. Conversations shift from philosophy to topics that would make an ecclesiarchy priest blanch. And through it all, the core members, the true cultists, carefully gauge who's comfortable with each escalation and who needs more time. This graduated exposure is crucial to Slaaneshi recruitment. You can't shock someone into the worship of the Dark Prince. You have to lead them down the garden path so gently they don't notice when the flowers become thorns and the sweet perfume becomes the stench of excess. By the time a recruit realizes something is deeply wrong, they've already participated in acts that would condemn them. Backing out means facing what they've become. Easier to keep going forward, to embrace it, to rationalize that if they're damned anyway, they might as well enjoy the damnation. Artistic and cultural circles provide another rich recruiting ground. The Imperium grudgingly tolerates art, provided it glorifies the Emperor or serves propaganda purposes. But true artists chafe under these restrictions, yearning to create something beautiful, meaningful, or challenging beyond approved themes. Slaanesh, god of excess and perfection, speaks directly to this yearning. A Slaaneshi cult might approach a talented but frustrated artist with an offer: patronage with no strings attached, materials of the highest quality, an audience that will truly appreciate their work. The only requirement is that the artist create without limitations or censorship. For someone who's spent years producing sterile propaganda pieces, this is paradise. They accept eagerly. The art they create, free from constraint, becomes progressively stranger and more obsessive. Sculptures that seem to move when viewed peripherally. Paintings whose colors shouldn't exist in nature. Music that makes listeners feel emotions they can't name. The artist pushes boundaries, seeking always to create something beyond what's been done before, chasing an impossible perfection. They don't realize the materials provided are warp-tainted, that their creative ecstasy is being deliberately cultivated, that each masterpiece pulls them closer to the Dark Prince. Eventually, their art becomes overtly corrupted. Canvas portraits whose subjects seem to breathe. Musical compositions that cause spontaneous hallucinations. Sculptures that whisper to viewers in the night. By this point, the artist doesn't care. They've touched something transcendent through their work, experienced sensations of creative fulfillment beyond mortal understanding. The cult reveals itself fully, and the artist joins willingly, eager to explore what other heights of perfection they might achieve in service to Slaanesh. If there's one truth about Slaaneshi corruption, it's this: the wealthy fall harder and faster than anyone else. The nobility and aristocracy of the Imperium, with their resources, boredom, and sense of entitlement, are practically gift-wrapped for the Dark Prince. They have everything materially, yet remain profoundly unsatisfied. Slaanesh offers them the only thing their wealth cannot buy: novelty and sensation beyond imagination. Consider a typical noble upbringing on a civilized world. From birth, they experience only the finest everything: the best food, the most exquisite wines, the most skilled entertainers, the most beautiful companions. By adolescence, they've exhausted every approved pleasure their station allows. And yet, human nature being what it is, they remain hungry for more. They've been raised to believe they deserve the best of everything, and now they've discovered the best the Imperium offers isn't quite enough. This is where Slaaneshi corruption finds its most receptive audience. A cult need only whisper that there are greater pleasures beyond imperial restriction, experiences reserved for those bold enough and sophisticated enough to pursue them. For a noble who's spent their entire life believing themselves superior to common folk, this appeal to their exclusivity is irresistible. Of course, such rarefied pleasures wouldn't be available to the masses. Of course, only someone of their refined sensibilities could truly appreciate them. The infamous case of House Calyx demonstrates this pattern perfectly. The noble house ruled a prosperous agri-world, respected pillars of imperial society for generations. The current Lord Calix, bored with his luxurious but predictable life, began collecting exotic artifacts and substances from off-world traders. Each acquisition was more rare and expensive than the last, a hobby befitting his station. One trader, actually a Slaaneshi cultist agent, sold him a particular delicacy, crystallized dream lotus from a distant world, rumored to produce visions of unearthly beauty. Lord Calix consumed it during a private dinner party with his closest associates. The visions it produced were indeed beautiful, but also profoundly disturbing, images of perfection that mortal senses weren't meant to perceive. Rather than recoiling in horror, the noble and his companions found themselves desperate to experience it again. The trader happily provided more, along with an invitation to meet others who shared this refined pursuit. Within months, House Calix had been introduced to an exclusive society of nobles from across several systems, all dedicated to exploring sensations beyond imperial approval. They met in secret estate chambers, hosting elaborate ceremonies that combined narcotics, sensory manipulation, and performances that would be considered obscene if their true nature were known to authorities. The escalation was textbook Slaanesh corruption. Exotic substances led to extreme experiences, which led to dangerous rituals, which led to actual demons summoning disguised as artistic happenings. By the time the Inquisition investigated, following reports of entire servant staffs gone missing, House Calix had transformed their estate into a temple of excess. The ballroom where they'd once hosted proper imperial galas was now a ritual chamber where nobles in states of ecstatic degradation worshipped the Dark Prince openly. The purge was spectacular. Inquisitorial stormtroopers found scenes that even these hardened veterans struggled to process. Nobles fused together in embraces that had become literal. Their flesh merged through a combination of surgical modification and warp mutation. Servants who'd been transformed into living furniture, conscious but unable to move or speak, existing only to serve as increasingly uncomfortable seats or tables. And at the center, Lord Calix himself, so altered by his pursuit of perfection that he barely retained human shape, a thing of too smooth skin stretched over wrong angles, still attempting to offer hospitality to his guests, even as flamers reduced his estate to ash. This pattern repeats across noble houses throughout the Imperium. Boredom and privilege create the perfect conditions for Slaanesh seduction. The cult approaches offering the only thing wealth cannot buy, genuine newness, and nobles, so accustomed to getting everything they desire, cannot conceive that this particular desire might destroy them. The particularly insidious aspect is how cults exploit noble social networks. When one house falls to Slaanesh, they inevitably try to bring their peers along, not out of malice necessarily, but because they genuinely believe they've discovered something wonderful that their friends should experience. "Darling, you simply must attend Lady Marcella's next soiree," they'll gush. "The entertainment was unlike anything I've ever witnessed, truly transcendent." The invitation comes from a trusted friend, from someone of their own class. How could it possibly be dangerous? Thus, corruption spreads through the aristocracy, like wildfire through dry grass, jumping from house to house through social connections. One cult cell might seat a dozen more as converted nobles, host their own salons, introduce their own contacts to the pleasures of excess. By the time authorities notice something amiss, an entire planet's ruling class might be compromised, all attending each other's increasingly depraved gatherings while maintaining perfect public propriety. Slaanesh is, above all else, the god of perfection and performance. This aspect attracts a specific type of individual, those who obsess over mastery, who cannot accept being merely good at something when excellence might be achievable. Artists, performers, athletes, scholars, anyone driven by the need to be the absolute best becomes a potential target for corruption through perfectionism. The path typically begins innocently. A musician practices her instrument for hours daily, pushing herself to technical mastery. A duelist trains relentlessly, seeking to perfect every movement. A scholar studies forbidden texts not for heretical knowledge, but for academic completeness. Their dedication is admirable by imperial standards, a proper application of human will toward worthy goals. But Slaanesh recognizes obsession when the god sees it. And obsession is merely devotion waiting for a worthier object. Cult agents watch for such individuals and approach them with a simple hook. I can help you achieve what you seek. For the musician, this might be a new technique that produces sounds of impossible beauty. For the duelist, a training method that pushes the body beyond normal limits. For the scholar, access to texts that contain knowledge available nowhere else. The offer is tailored precisely to the target's obsession, and those consumed by the drive for perfection rarely refuse. The assistance provided does work, which makes it all the more insidious. The musician's skill does improve dramatically. The duelist does become faster, more precise. The scholar does gain insights others lack. But the methods involve making small compromises. The musician must practice not in daylight, but at midnight, when certain acoustics are better. The duelist must consume a special tonic before training, just nutrients to enhance performance, nothing suspicious. The scholar must read the texts aloud in the original tongue, even if that tongue makes their throat hurt to pronounce. These small concessions create dependency. The perfectionist finds they can only achieve their peak performance under these specific conditions. Missing a midnight practice session leaves the musician feeling off-key all day. Training without the tonic makes the duelist sluggish. Reading in Gothic translation doesn't provide the same insights. They tell themselves it's psychological, just routine and superstition. But actually, they're being conditioned, slowly attuned to the warp through repeated exposure to its tainted gifts. The cult then reveals the truth gradually. Perhaps the musician learns the technique they've been practicing was developed by a legendary performer who served Slaanesh. Perhaps the duelist discovers their tonic contains refined, warp-touched ingredients. Perhaps the scholar realizes the texts they've been reading are prayers, and they've been speaking devotions to the Dark Prince all along. By this point, stopping means abandoning the perfection they've achieved. And for someone driven by obsession, that's unthinkable. They rationalize their continued participation. The power source doesn't matter, only the results. If the warp provides tools for excellence, why not use them? The Emperor himself used warp power, didn't he? Surely perfecting one's craft in service to humanity, even through questionable means, is better than mediocrity. The logical leaps become increasingly absurd, but the mind caught in obsession will justify anything to continue the pursuit. Eventually, the pursuit of perfection becomes explicitly worship. The musician doesn't just practice. They perform ceremonies where music is offered as devotion to Slaanesh. The duelist doesn't just fight. They engage in ritual combat that spills blood in sacred patterns. The scholar doesn't just read. They speak prophecies channeled from the warp. And they do so with genuine fervor, convinced they're part of something greater, that their obsession has found its true purpose. The cult benefits immensely from such converts. A musician who's touched the warp can create performances that entrance audiences, making them susceptible to recruitment. A warrior perfected through Slaaneshi gifts can defeat enemies far beyond their normal capability. A scholar versed in forbidden knowledge can unlock secrets that advance the cult's goals. These obsessive perfectionists become the cult's most effective tools, driven not by fear or greed, but by their own impossible standards. And the Dark Prince's promise that those standards can be met. There's a particular tragedy to this form of corruption. These were individuals who genuinely wanted to improve themselves, to achieve something meaningful. In a better universe, their dedication might have produced great works that uplifted humanity. Instead, their drive for excellence became the hook that dragged them into damnation. Their finest achievements transformed into offerings to a god of excess. Let us discuss, with appropriate cynicism, the role of substances in Slaaneshi corruption. The Imperium, in its wisdom, forbids most recreational drugs while simultaneously ensuring populations live in conditions that make substance abuse seem perfectly reasonable. This creates a black market, and wherever there's illicit trade, cults find opportunity. But Slaaneshi cultists don't merely sell narcotics for profit. They use them as sacraments, each dose a prayer, each high a step closer to the Dark Prince. The progression typically follows a predictable pattern. A desperate worker, exhausted from another grinding shift, seeks something to ease the pain and monotony. They approach a dealer in the underhive, maybe someone recommended by a co-worker. The dealer, smiling sympathetically, offers exactly what they need, a chem that makes the body stop aching, makes the mind forget its worries, makes the gray world seem bearable for a few hours. The first doses are almost mundane by narcotic standards, perhaps refined obscura, or a mild synth stimulant that boosts mood without obvious side effects. The worker pays, uses it, feels better. They return when the effect wears off and reality becomes unbearable again. The dealer is always available, always friendly, always willing to extend credit if funds run short. A perfect trap, really. The Imperium creates the despair, the dealer provides the escape, and the worker becomes dependent. But here's where Slaaneshi corruption differs from simple addiction. The dealer gradually introduces variations, new formulas that produce not just relief but genuine pleasure. Chems that make food taste incredible, make music sound transcendent, make physical sensation overwhelmingly intense. The worker discovers that life can be more than just absence of pain. It can actively feel good. This revelation is dangerous. Once you've experienced real joy, even chemically induced, returning to mere survival becomes intolerable. The substances themselves begin to change in subtle ways. A dealer might explain they've acquired a new supply, purer quality, better effects. What they don't mention is that this new batch has been refined using warp-touched methods, or contains trace elements from demon worlds, or has been blessed in ceremonies to Slaanesh. The chemical high begins carrying spiritual weight. Users report experiences beyond normal narcotic effects, visions of impossible beauty, sensations that seem to touch the soul, moments where reality feels thin and something vast watches from beyond. These experiences aren't side effects. They're the point. The cult is using the substances to gradually attune users to the warp, making their souls more sensitive to Slaaneshi influence. Each dose is a micro-ritual, each high a prayer, whether the user realizes it or not. The dealer might eventually invite heavy users to special sessions, group experiences where everyone takes the substance together and shares the journey. These gatherings have all the structure of religious ceremonies because that's exactly what they are. Worship services disguised as drug parties. Users who reach this stage often find themselves experiencing withdrawal symptoms that go beyond physical. They crave not just the chemical, but the spiritual sensation it provides, the feeling of touching something greater than themselves. When the dealer mentions that certain rituals could intensify these experiences, make them permanent, provide that sensation without needing substances at all, many accept eagerly They've been prepared, their souls conditioned through repeated exposure, ready to embrace Slaanesh fully. The cult benefits in multiple ways from this approach. They generate revenue from sales that funds operations. They create a steady stream of recruits, already partway to corruption. And they establish distribution networks that can move cult materials and messages alongside the narcotics. A dealer cell in one hab block connects to a manufacturing operation in another, which links to importers from off-world, creating a web that spans entire cities or even systems. Moreover, this method targets the vulnerable, people who are suffering and see no other options. It's exploitation of the cruelest sort, offering genuine relief from pain while simultaneously ensuring that relief becomes the instrument of damnation. The addicts believe they're self-medicating, coping with an impossible existence in the only way available. They don't realize they're being deliberately cultivated, their desperation harvested as soul crop for the Dark Prince. The Imperium's response to this threat is characteristically short-sighted. They crack down on narcotic trade with brutal efficiency, executing dealers and users alike. But they do nothing to address the conditions that create demand for escape in the first place. They purge the symptom while leaving the disease untouched. Within weeks of a major crackdown, new dealers appear, new substances circulate, and the cycle continues. The cult simply reconstitutes itself, perhaps under new leadership, but with the same basic operation. There comes a point in every Slaaneshi cult's development where the mask of civilization drops entirely, and the true nature of their worship becomes undeniable. This escalation from hidden indulgence to open horror follows patterns that repeat across countless worlds with tiresome predictability. Understanding this progression helps explain how seemingly harmless pleasure seekers transform into the shrieking devotees found when Imperial forces finally purge a cult cell. The transition typically occurs when normal sensations no longer satisfy. This is the nature of Slaanesh's corruption. What once brought pleasure eventually becomes insufficient. The gourmet meal that tasted divine a month ago now seems bland. The narcotic that produced ecstasy now barely registers. The performance that moved one to tears now feels hollow. The cult member finds themselves on a hedonic treadmill, requiring ever greater intensity to achieve the same effect. The cult leadership, often under direct demonic influence by this stage, encourages this escalation. They introduce new experiences deliberately calibrated to push boundaries. Perhaps a ritual that combines pain with pleasure. Teaching initiates that sensation is sensation, regardless of whether mortal minds label it positive or negative. Perhaps ceremonies where participants' perceptions are warped through psychic manipulation, making them experience impossible senses or alien emotions. The goal is to break down the mental categories that distinguish normal from aberrant, acceptable from excessive. Physical modification that often begins around this stage. What started as cosmetic enhancement, a surgical improvement here, a minor augmetic there, becomes extreme body modification in pursuit of aesthetic or sensory perfection. Cultists might undergo procedures to add extrasensory organs, to heighten nerve sensitivity beyond human norms, to reshape their bodies into forms they consider more beautiful, even if those forms are anatomically absurd. The line between willing improvement and Slaaneshi mutation blurs until it's meaningless. The most dangerous development is when the cult begins engaging in acts that cause harm to non-members. Early on, cult activities might have been consensual among participants, however depraved. But as the need for intensity grows, consent becomes an impediment. They begin kidnapping victims to serve as unwilling participants in their ceremonies. These unfortunates are subjected to experiences designed to extract maximum sensation, their suffering and terror adding spice to the ritual. The cultists rationalize this easily. They're providing their victims with sensations those dull masses would never otherwise experience. It's practically a gift. The rituals themselves become increasingly extreme. Early ceremonies might have been elaborate dinner parties with exotic entertainment. Now they're events that would make a demon blush. Imagine a chamber where every surface writhes with living, tissue grafted from willing or unwilling donors. Participants whose bodies have been surgically or warp enhanced to experience sensation in ways nature never intended. Acts performed that combine elements of art, violence, pleasure, and pain into gestures that defy description, but satisfy the dark prince's appetite for excess. This is also when demonic manifestation becomes commonplace. The cult has been building warp resonance through their activities, and now reality in their sanctum has grown thin enough for entities to pierce through. Daemonettes appear during ceremonies, joining in with disturbing enthusiasm. These manifestations are welcomed, treated as honored guests, or even gods made manifest. Cultists who've reached this point of degradation no longer see anything wrong with this. If anything, direct contact with the divine is proof they've achieved something transcendent. The most disturbing aspect is how cult members at this stage retain enough intelligence to function in normal society during daylight hours. The administratum clerk who spent his night in a blood-soaked orgy of sensation can still file reports accurately the next morning. The noble who participated in rituals of exquisite cruelty can still attend formal dinners and make appropriate small talk. They compartmentalize brilliantly, maintaining their facade while counting the hours until they can return to their true worship. This dual existence can persist for surprising lengths of time before discovery. The cult grows bolder, their ceremonies grander, their excesses more pronounced. They might take over entire sections of a hive, creating zones where their worship occurs openly, while surrounding areas remain ignorant. They might corrupt local authorities to ensure protection, turning enforcers and arbits into either participants or blind eyes. The rot spreads until something finally breaks, usually spectacularly. The breaking point often comes when the cult attempts something too ambitious. Perhaps they try to summon a keeper of secrets, a greater demon of Slaanesh, requiring a ritual of such magnitude that it cannot be hidden. Perhaps their modified members become so mutated they can no longer pass for human. Perhaps a victim escapes and manages to report what they experienced before being silenced. However it happens, discovery is inevitable. The cult has grown too large, too corrupt, too confident in its invulnerability. When Imperial forces finally respond, they find scenes that strain comprehension. Chambers where the boundaries between bodies have become negotiable through surgery and mutation. Victims preserved in states of perpetual sensation, neither alive nor dead, kept conscious to fuel ongoing rituals. Artworks created using mediums no sane mind would conceive. And at the center, the cult's leadership, often transformed beyond recognition, still attempting to conduct ceremonies, even as flamers turn their sanctum to ash. The purge is total because it must be. Slaaneshi corruption runs deep, and those exposed to it are considered beyond redemption. Everyone even tangentially associated with the cult faces execution. The buildings they used are demolished. The very ground is sanctified or destroyed. Yet despite this thoroughness, the cult's end is rarely complete. Some members, those clever enough to avoid the deepest corruption, or lucky enough to be absent during the purge, survive and slip away. And thus, the cycle begins anew elsewhere. After examining the mechanics of Slaaneshi corruption across social strata and scenarios, one arrives at an uncomfortable conclusion. This particular form of heresy is fundamentally different from worship of the other ruinous powers. Khorne's cults are driven by rage and violence, easily identified and purged. Nurgle's followers display obvious physical corruption. Tzeentch's schemes eventually become too complex to maintain coherence. But Slaanesh, the Dark Prince's corruption, hides behind humanity's most basic and understandable desires: to feel good, to be special, to achieve perfection, to escape suffering. This makes it the most insidious corruption of all. You cannot purge the desire for pleasure from human nature. You cannot eliminate ambition, curiosity, or the drive for excellence without destroying what makes humans more than servitors. The Imperium tries, certainly, crushing joy and desire under its authoritarian boot. But this approach merely creates populations more vulnerable to promises of sensation and meaning. In attempting to starve out Slaaneshi corruption, the Imperium creates the perfect conditions for it to flourish. The case studies we've examined, from noble house collapses to underhive narcotic cults, from obsessive perfectionists to chemical sacraments, all share common threads. They begin with something relatable. A person wants to feel better, to be better, to have more. Slaanesh offers a path to achieve those wants, and that first step seems harmless. By the time the corruption becomes obvious, the victim is thoroughly ensnared, having made countless small compromises that led them far from where they intended to go. The tragedy, if one permits oneself such sentiment, is that many who fall to Slaanesh started with genuinely positive motivations. The artist who wanted to create beauty, the healer who sought to perfect their craft and ease suffering, the worker who just wanted their family to eat something other than corpse starch. These weren't bad people. They were people living in a system that offered them nothing but pain and deprivation, who grasped at the first hand extended to lift them out of misery. That the hand belonged to damnation itself is almost beside the point. From a coldly analytical perspective, Slaaneshi cults demonstrate remarkable efficiency in their operations. They self-fund through vice trades. They recruit across all social classes, creating networks that span from underhive to spire. They protect themselves through blackmail and corruption of authorities. They expand gradually, avoiding the attention that mass violence or obvious mutation would bring. By the time they're discovered, they've often compromised significant portions of a population, requiring extensive purges that damage the world's productivity and stability. The Inquisition's records show a frustrating pattern. Worlds cleared of Slaaneshia, Baoshu influence, inevitably develop new cults within a generation. The conditions that created the first cult remain unchanged. New individuals discover the same vulnerabilities, make the same choices, fall into the same damnation. It's a cycle that cannot be broken by force alone, yet the Imperium knows no other response. Purge, rebuild, wait for the rot to return, purge again. An endless, exhausting struggle against an enemy that regenerates from humanity's own nature. One might almost admire Slaanesh's approach if it weren't so horrific. The Dark Prince doesn't demand absolute loyalty from the start. The god offers a transaction: pleasure for service, sensation for devotion, perfection for corruption. Many accept thinking they're getting the better deal, believing they can take the gifts without paying the price. They're always wrong, of course. Slaanesh is patient, and the debt always comes due, but the illusion of choice makes the trap more effective than any chain. The question that haunts those who study this particular heresy is whether there's any defense against it beyond the Imperium's current brutal suppression. Could education help? Unlikely, as the allure of Slaanesh speaks to parts of human psychology that exist regardless of knowledge. Could better living conditions reduce vulnerability? Perhaps. But the Imperium's entire structure depends on keeping populations desperate and compliant. Could some form of permitted pleasure inoculate against forbidden excess? Laughable, the ecclesiarchy would call such suggestion heresy itself. Thus, we're left with the status quo, an Imperium that creates misery, cults that exploit that misery, and an endless war between them with human souls as the battlefield. The only winners are the Dark Prince, who feeds on the excess generated by both sides, and those with the dark humor to appreciate the irony, which is to say, practically no one. For those reading this analysis, perhaps seeking to understand or identify Slaaneshi corruption in their midst, remember, it doesn't announce itself with 8-pointed stars and demonic manifestations at first. It arrives as an invitation to something better, offered by someone who seems to understand your desires. It grows through small steps that seem reasonable until you look back and realize how far you've walked into darkness. And by the time you recognize it for what it is, you're typically already compromised enough that exposure means death. The practical advice, delivered with appropriate cynicism: trust nothing that offers pleasure without visible cost. Question anyone who claims they can make you perfect. Avoid gatherings where the entertainment is described as transcendent or beyond description. Report unusual narcotic effects immediately. And if someone offers you an experience beyond imperial approval, perhaps consider why imperial approval exists in the first place. It's often there because what lies beyond it will destroy you. Of course, this advice assumes rational actors making informed choices. Slaaneshi corruption preys specifically on moments of weakness, desperation, or obsession when rationality is already compromised. The worker exhausted beyond thought accepts the chem without question. The artist consumed by their vision doesn't pause to analyze the offered assistance. The noble bored into existential crisis isn't thinking about long-term consequences. In these moments of vulnerability, no amount of warnings will stop someone from reaching for what seems like salvation. So the cycle continues. Cults form, recruit, expand, escalate, and eventually burn. The Imperium responds with purges that create new grievances and new desperations. Slaanesh watches from beyond the veil, endlessly amused by the performance. And somewhere, right now, on countless worlds, someone is taking that first step toward corruption, believing themselves too clever to fall completely, too strong to be consumed. They're wrong, but they'll discover that only when it's far too late. In the grim darkness of the far future, humanity faces many enemies: Xenos, heretics, demons, the galaxy itself. But perhaps none so dangerous as their own desires turned against them. Slaanesh doesn't conquer through force. The Dark Prince seduces, corrupts, transforms willing participants into weapons against their own species. And the terrible truth is that this approach works perfectly, has worked for 10,000 years, and will continue working until either humanity learns restraint, which seems unlikely, or there's nothing left of humanity to corrupt. Sleep well with that thought. And tomorrow, when someone offers you something that seems too good to be true, remember, in the Imperium, it definitely is. The only question is what price you'll pay before you realize it.